Wonderful.
Okay,
So,
great. Well,
Marceline, take it away.
all right. Happy to do so. Good afternoon again and welcome everyone. We're so excited to speak to everyone and have people from all over the state to have this conversation about economic rights and what's in store for working families at the national level and the state level. My name is Marceline White, and I'm Executive Director of Economic Action Maryland Fund, aka Economic Action. And just wanted to take a second and tell you before we get started a little bit about the housekeeping rules. We're going to start off talking about the state policy agenda, but we may pause and be flexible so that when Senator Van Hollen can join the conversation, we have plenty of time for him to join, and then we may go back to the state policy agenda. Unfortunately, he's not going to have time to take questions right now because he is very busy, as you can imagine, but we'll be happy to take questions afterwards about the state policy work. Jennifer Bevan Dangle, who you've been hearing from, is going to be monitoring the chat for questions and any technical difficulties. And I'll be talking a lot about state policy bills and bill numbers. Don't worry, we will send this out to everyone registered for the webinar early next week, so you'll have more information about each of the bills and the bill numbers as we move forward. So don't worry about trying to rapidly take notes for anything like that. Just who we are, Economic Action is a statewide organization. We advance economic rights, equity, and housing justice through research, education, policy advocacy, and direct service. We really work to build a people-powered movement across the state for economic justice and racial justice. And if you aren't already involved, we definitely invite you to join us to organize and advocate for policies that benefit working families across the state. We'll tell you how to do that later on, but we're so happy you're here with us today. And I do want to say our direct service programs, which focus on older adults, tenants, and fair housing touch every corner of the state, and we've served clients everywhere across Maryland, and that informs the policy and advocacy work that we do. So, I think we can all agree that it's been a rough week at the federal level, to say the very least. And I think it's challenging in times like this to know what to do or where to put our energies and our effort. Um, Joe Hill, who's a famous labor activist in Wobbly, said, "Don't mourn and organize." And I think that's true, although, of course, it makes sense to take a bit of time to reflect and grieve. But we have so much work ahead of us, and none of us can do this alone, more now than ever. I've been thinking a lot this week that we are really fortunate to live in Maryland, where we have a governor, attorney general, as well as legislators who believe in policies that protect and support working families and address racial disparities. Together, we can pass progressive policies in Maryland, but it will take all of us because even with, um, a majority Democratic state in the General Assembly, we need everyone to work together to make their voices heard, to make sure we're passing progressive economic policies. So I'm just going to start off and tell you a little bit about our policy agenda, do a little bit of table setting at the beginning, and then talk about some of the bills that we're going to be working on. And again, we will be sending out a more detailed notes after this with the numbers and some information about them, so no need to take rapid notes. The first area we're working on is medical debt. Um, in 2023, 14% of Maryland households, about 876,000 households, had a medical debt that they were unable to pay. Of those households, Black and Latino households were disproportionately affected and hold more medical debt. Over a 9-year period, Maryland's nonprofit hospitals filed more than 145,000 lawsuits to collect from patients who sought care from them. The average amount the hospital sued for was $945, and the lawsuits were highest in low-income, majority Black and Brown communities. In addition to the hospital medical debt, 44% of medical debt comes from outpatient visits. So what are we doing? Um, We are working on legislation. It's House Bill 268 with Delegate Lori Charkoudian and Senator Stephen Hershey because medical debt is a bipartisan issue. This legislation will expand access to hospital financial assistance policies for working families. It will do that. It will also ban reporting of medical debt to the major credit reporting agencies, which is something at the federal level, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has done, but it's already faced lawsuits in Texas to roll that back. It will also ban hospitals from suing low-income patients for medical debt that's $500 or less, which is about 25% of all the lawsuits we saw. That bill is having a hearing in the House on Wednesday, January 29th, in the House Government Operations, um, HGO. We're also working on outpatient medical debt not in hospitals. So Senate Bill 349, sponsored by Senator Sarah Love, and the House bill by Delegate Elizabeth Embry takes on outpatient medical debt. It will ban a lien on your home for outpatient medical debt. It will also eliminate a practice that Baltimore City and several counties have where any consumer debt becomes an automatic lien on your home. And it will eliminate that practice for consumer debt if the debt is medical debt. And that bill has a hearing on Wednesday, January 29th in Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. The third bill that we're working on medical debt is sponsored by Delegate Julie Polakovich-Carr, and it will ban reporting of medical debt to major credit reporting agencies for outpatient medical debt. Delegate Charkoudian's focus is on hospital medical debt. It will extend that ban to include high-cost credit cards like Care One, which many patients use and create unaffordable credit issues. And it will prohibit landlords will prohibit the reporting of medical debt to landlords who use credit screening tools to assess whether or not someone can rent from them. Another issue we're working on, in terms of housing justice, is really looking at, just in terms of table setting, why we're working on this, is that more than 30,000 Marylanders experience homelessness, and more than 5,000 Maryland families are made homeless each year because of an eviction. In FY24, landlords filed 5,104 no-cause evictions, which is an increase of 62% from pre-COVID numbers. And because of structural racism, 1 in 4 Black children in renting households faces the threat of eviction each year. Economic Action Maryland Fund is on the steering committee of Renters United Maryland, so we're supporting a number of bills led by the coalition. One of the bills is Good Cause, which is led by Delegate Janelle Wilkins and Senator Anthony Muse. This law will protect tenants from retaliation and from being evicted for no reason at all. Promotes housing stability, and it's local enabling legislation, meaning it would allow counties across Maryland to adopt their own good cause laws that meet local needs. This will be the 8th year the bill is introduced, and we're hoping that it will pass this year. Another rental bill we're working on is a Rent Tenant Possession Recovery Act, which is sponsored by Delegate Jen Terrassa and Senator Charles Sidner. And that is, the Senate bill number is Senate Bill 442. Right now, there's no state law that requires tenants to receive notice of their eviction date and no window to reclaim their possessions. 46 other states have stronger protections for tenants than Maryland does. This bill will require that tenants receive a 14-day notice of their scheduled eviction, and they have a 10-day window to reclaim their possessions before a landlord can dispose of them. We are also working on a rent collusion bill. Many of you may have seen the Washington Post article. The RealPage, a property management company, is using private rental data to suggest rental prices to landlords. Last year, a White House study found that these kinds of rental algorithms increased rents by an average of $70 a month. And we know that households across Maryland are struggling with rising rental prices. This legislation, sponsored by Delegate Julie Palakovich Carr and Senator Sarah Love, will prohibit the use of personal data to set rental pricing. In terms of homeowners, we also know that many homeowners in Maryland are now struggling. More than 25% are cost burdened, meaning they pay more than 30% of their income on mortgage and rent, on mortgage or property taxes. House Bill 59 and Senate Bill 192 will protect low-income homeowners by raising the threshold to $1,000 before a property can be sold at tax sale. We'll also create a process for a state tax sale ombudsman to reach out to homeowners who are facing tax sale and connect them with supportive services to try to avert the sale of their home, um, which often they own outright and would lose the home and all the equity. Um, this is going to benefit thousands of low-income homeowners, particularly older adults. We are also working on fair housing, and that legislation is sponsored by Senator Charles Sidner and Delegate Sandy Bartlett. It's SB 107 and House Bill 392. It deals with one-party recording. The House hearing is on February 4th in House Judiciary. It allows fair housing programs around the state and fair housing organizations to record um, on their own without two-party consent while they're testing for fair housing discrimination. So, um, more than 30 other states already allow people, when you're testing for fair housing, to record to determine if there's been discrimination. And this would allow us to come in line with these 30 other states. We know there's a number of we know there's discrimination in rental housing, and we need all the tools in the toolkit to be able to document that and hold property management companies, realtors, and others accountable. Another issue that we're working on is the issue of utilities. I think probably most folks on this call would agree that utility costs have been rising. We know that the turnoff notices have been skyrocketing over the past 2 years. And, BG's rates have tripled since 2010, and Columbia gas rates have increased more than 3 times the inflation rate. Think you may be joined right now, so I might pause right there. We are joined right now by Senator Van Hollen. We are thrilled to have you here. He really needs no introduction, but I think I will simply say that, as you all know, Senator Van Hollen has been a champion for working families, both in the Maryland House of in the Maryland General Assembly and for more than a decade in the House and Senate in Congress, and he serves on key committees in banking and budget. So we are so grateful for your time. We know what a busy time it is, and I just want to thank you so much for joining us to talk a little bit about what's happening at the national level.
Well, thank you, Marceline. And let me start by thanking you for all your leadership at Economic Action Maryland. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. And to all the members of your team and the volunteers, buckle up. This is going to be a bumpy ride, and we're going to have to work very hard to ensure that we have an economy that works for working people in the United States of America. And I know that you're committed to that goal in Maryland, and we want to make sure that we focus on that in Maryland and around the country, because if the first 4 days of the Trump administration are indicator of the next 4 years, we're going to have to fight like hell, in my view, to protect working men and women in the country. And I just want to start with the theme that, Donald Trump ran on as a candidate. One of the themes was he was going to be out there fighting for working men and women. But if you look at the actions taken just in the first 4 days, they have nothing to do with that, right? So one of the first things he did, as you know, is pardon individuals who had been convicted of assaulting and bloodying and bludgeoning police officers. So for somebody who pretended to be the law and order candidate, what he showed was total contempt for law enforcement. And it, of course, sends a terrible message around the country that if you commit violence in the name of Donald Trump, you will get a pardon. So that was one of the first actions. And of course, he also issued a slew of executive orders. If you go through them, you'll find, for example, one that will rescind, take away a number of initiatives that are designed to lower the costs of prescription drugs for Americans. You'll also find a number that would convert the merit-based civil service into a cronyism-based civil service. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But the other thing we know is the prime goal of the new Trump era was really captured by the photograph that we witnessed during the swearing in, because when Donald Trump said he was going to bring a golden age to America, what he meant was an old golden age for the CEO tech titans who were sitting right behind him, right? These are billionaires who are given better seats even than the incoming, Trump cabinet members that he's trying to get through the Senate. And that was a clear indication that this is going to be a government by Donald Trump for the very wealthy at the expense of everybody else. And one of the biggest and quickest fights we're going to have is over a tax plan being presented by Donald Trump. And we're really going to need your help and engagement on this because what they're proposing for Trump Tax Plan 2.0 is Trump Tax Plan 1.0 on steroids. And if you go back and look at that plan, it hugely disproportionately benefited the very wealthy and big corporations. And it did so at the expense of everybody else. If you look at the claims they made at the time, and I'm talking now back in 2017, about what that tax plan would do, all of their claims crashed head on into reality. So, for example, they claimed that by giving big corporations these tax cuts, that the corporations would invest in more plant and equipment and grow that business. Instead, what those savings were used for were stock buybacks, right? So there were stock buybacks that, helped very wealthy shareholders. They claimed that some of the other savings that they got from that big corporate tax cut would go to increase the wages of their employees, right? If you give us a tax cut, we can give everybody a raise. In fact, they said it would be a $4,000 on average raise. Didn't happen. It just did not happen. They said it would not, increase the deficits and debt. Again, it didn't happen. Obviously, it increased the deficits and debt over time because it was a huge revenue tax giveaway to very wealthy people. So all the claims they made at the time crashed into the wall of reality and never happened. And now they're going to try to reenact Trump, 1.0 tax plan, but make it even more generous to the very wealthy. And they're very clearly talking about how they're going to save $2 trillion. And if you go to the plan that was just outlined by the House Republican Budget Committee chair, a fellow by the name of Congressman Jody Arrington, you will find all the things they're coming after are things that help make life more affordable for working men and women in the middle class. So we're talking about coming after affordable health care, including Medicaid. They're also talking about, coming after some of the food and nutrition programs. We have to look out for efforts to go after Medicare and Social Security. So the point being, it's not just a tax giveaway to the very rich. It's a tax giveaway to the very rich at the expense of other working Americans. So we've got to really be on guard to fight this. They're going to try to use it. They will use a procedure that would allow them to pass this with only Republican votes in the House and Senate. It's called the reconciliation procedure. They do have very tight margins, though, of course, in the House, especially. And so we have an opportunity to really make it clear that this is a tax plan not for working men and women, but for the very wealthy. Now, on top of that, since we're focused on a lot of the economic issues and bread and butter issues, he has talked about raising tariffs across the board. And I do want to take a moment to talk about this because I support targeted tariffs in strategic sectors, right? Semiconductors, areas where it's very important that we protect vital American industries. But if you raise a tariff across the board, it is pure and simple an increase in the tax, and it's like a sales tax increase for everybody. So he's talking on the one hand about a tax plan that will help the very wealthy, but they're also going to have if he follows through on 10 to 25% across the board increases in tariffs, that will spike prices for Americans from coast to coast. So that's another thing we need to look at. Now, I also want to take a moment to talk about some key federal agencies that are designed to protect consumers. And as you know, Marceline, we've talked in the past about the important work they do at the FTC and the Consumer Protection, CFTC, the Consumer Protection Bureau. So let me just start with the FTC. The chair was Lina Khan. She really was focused on looking out for consumers. She filed a number of antitrust cases to prevent mergers that would essentially have monopoly power and be able to raise prices on everybody else in the country. She stopped a number of those. She did a whole range of things using the powers of the FTC to try to make the economy better and protect consumers. One that I worked with her closely on was something called the click to cancel rule. This is just one example. I don't know, a lot of Americans have experienced the phenomena where you go on a streaming service, for example, and it says free, you got a week free, and then you can cancel. Well, a lot of times you click on, you get a week free, they start charging you, and it becomes very difficult actually to cancel your order. So they keep charging you even after you have tried to cancel. So the bill I filed was called the Consumer Opt-in Act, and it required affirmative opt-in by the consumers after that trial period. And the FTC under Lina Khan's leadership implemented a rule that would accomplish the goal of the legislation. So that's just one example of something that impacts, Americans every day, and they get stuck in paying for these things that they don't want. So at the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, we've had Rohit Chopra, and I and many of you have worked with him on a number of important consumer protection issues. And I just want to talk about a few of them. There are many examples, but one of the things that we urged him to do, and which he did, was to enact a rule to stop banks from charging these huge overdraft fees and squeezing more and more profits out of their poorest consumers, right? So you go and you buy a cup of coffee, and you go, your account doesn't have enough money in it, you get an overdraft fee. And then you go and buy, dash door to the store and buy something else, you get another one. And the overdraft fees are not nearly related to the cost to the bank of dealing with this. So he took action on that through a rule. It's going to be about $5 billion in savings to consumers. And that is a big, big number, of course. We also worked very hard, and Marceline, I know you worked with us on this and other members of your team on the medical debt issue. We've talked about that in the past. And, it should not be the case in America that when you have a big accident or you have an unforeseen disease, that because we still don't have a really we have a better health insurance system after the Affordable Care Act, but you could still end up having to dish out a ton of money if you're still not insured under one of those plans or even under some of those plans. And so it should not be the case that you get into an accident or you have an unforeseen illness that all of a sudden you have to not just pay more, which is bad enough, but lose your credit rating. And so what they did was say that you cannot use the medical debt someone has in their bill, which more often than not is just a one-time big spike because of the costs that, of a health emergency, that you cannot use that amount to lower someone's credit rating, to go after them. And that affects about 15 million Americans. On top of all that, if you look at what they did, they helped return, they went after predatory lending, they went after a lot of very bad actors. And just look at Maryland consumers, $71 million was recovered for just Maryland consumers. And of course, the number nationally was much, much bigger than that. So we've got a Trump administration coming in that would like to get rid of the CFPB. In fact, Elon Musk tweeted out that he wants to delete the CFPB. So you can see the fight we're in. They tried to do this through the courts. The Supreme Court blocked their effort to get rid of the CFPB through the courts, but that doesn't mean that they won't try to do it legislatively at this point, something that we've blocked them from doing to date. And so finally, let me just take a moment to talk about their efforts, as I said earlier, to politicize these federal appointments, okay? Presidents already get lots of political appointees. There are about 4,000 political appointees in any given administration. And that's fine, right? I mean, when presidents come in, they, of course, have the right to bring people into their senior positions. That's why you have your cabinet officials, you get to select those. So there are already about 4,000 political appointees. But, back in the late 1800s, we did a really smart thing as a country, which is we developed rules for a merit-based civil service, right? So you get hired based on your qualifications, your experience, your knowledge. It's based on what you know, not based on who you know. And they want to use this device called Schedule F. You'll hear more about it. It's a regulation that they want to put in place, or a new executive order that they want to put in place, that would convert, as a starter, about 50,000 positions in the federal government from merit-based to political cronyism-based, where people do not have any due process rights if they're fired. Now, so that allows them to put in place people chosen not because of what they know and their competence, but based on a political loyalty. And we are fighting this very hard. We're going to be primarily, in the first instance, working with lawyers, because lawsuits are going to be filed. Dealing with this legislatively is challenging. We've introduced a bill that would prevent this, but of course we need the votes to get the bill passed. We tried to pass it in the last Congress, and the Republicans blocked it. So we're going to have to, at least for now, work through the court system to try to prevent some of these abuses. I'm going to mention one other area, and then I'm happy to try and take questions. I have been very focused, as you all have, on housing costs and homelessness, and I do look forward to working to try to address those issues. I do have an important bipartisan piece of legislation that provides a voucher that allows low-income families with young kids, meaning 6 and under, to move to areas of higher opportunity with various wraparound services. It's been proven empirically, lots of studies to show that will help. That helps break the cycle of poverty for families. I do have a Republican co-sponsor, and we're going to try to get that passed. But again, in this environment, it's going to be tough. But we have we have to do two things. We have to try to stop bad things from happening, and that will consume lots of our time, but we will, wherever possible, look for ways to actually, advance some important positive initiatives. So defense and then offense, and thank all of you for, being part of this really important effort to build an economy that is there for every American, not just for the tech titans and the billionaires.
Senator, I want to thank you. I am so happy you are there fighting for us and have been there for so long, fighting the good fight. Um, and really appreciating taking the time. Do you have time for one or two questions?
I do. I can take a
Okay.
couple. Thanks.
Okay, great. So Jennifer Bevan Dangle, our Deputy Director, is asking people to put a question or two in the chat, and then I think she can read them out. So,
And Senator, the one question that did come up while you were speaking was just more of a plea to please do what you can to protect the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. So I know you already spoke to that, but if there's any immediate next steps that citizens could do to help with that fight, um, it might be too early for citizen engagement, but anything people could be looking for or do, I know they would appreciate hearing about.
Sure. Well, there are two things. One is, protecting the agency at its own existence, right? And then, of course, there's the issue of who's running it and operating it. So, in terms of protecting the continued existence of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, um, any effort to undo that and take it away would have to come through the United States Congress because it currently has a separate funding mechanism through the Federal Reserve, and so legislation would be required to actually undo that whole structure, a structure which the Supreme Court recently upheld. Now, Republicans may well try to get that legislation through the House and the Senate. I mean, they have majorities, but we will use our blocking power to some extent in the Senate to try to stop that from happening. Now, we of course have the issue of who's going to run the CFPB. Right, last time around, Mick Mulvaney was the person chosen. He later became the head of OMB for a period of time during the last Trump administration, and then became Trump's chief of staff. And Mick Mulvaney had been a congressman, but as head of the CFPB, he was not there to protect consumers against predatory lending, for example. One of the big initiatives that I and others had pushed was to protect against predatory lending. In fact, lawsuits have been filed. So, we will have we'll see where we go when it comes to running the Consumer Finance Protection Agency, and obviously, do what we can to support important initiatives. We're going to be somewhat at the whim of who they put there. What I can be more confident of is that we can prevent them from actually dismantling the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau.
that's wonderful. Yes, we've worked with Director Chopra, and he's been dynamic and really so forceful and principled in combating predatory lending, and brought back millions of dollars for Marylanders as well as Americans across the country. So whatever we can do to make sure that the CFPB is still intact, whoever the director is, so that those guidance and analysis and data and some of those other things can go forward at the very least. We appreciate what you're doing there. And I don't see other questions in the chat, so I just want to thank you so much for your time and your leadership in the Senate on these issues. And please, let us know whatever we can do to help support the work you're doing. We're happy to get it out to all of our members and supporters.
Well, thank you. It's great to have you as partners in this
Absolutely.
effort. So it takes teamwork. So
I
thank you
appreciate it.
and everybody who's part of this effort. All
Thank
right.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And while we pull back up the slideshow with more information on the legislative work, I do want to acknowledge there's been so many really good and thoughtful comments about building power and changing the dynamic and better messaging to reach the electorate. We recognize and value that. This is an event hosted by Economic Action Maryland Fund, which is a C3 entity. So we're not going to be able to dive into some of those aspects of the work today. Do please stay in touch with us because we do have an affiliated organization, Economic Action Maryland, that will be building power and far more engaged in that side of the work. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that other entity in the next few months to come. So please do stay in touch on those issues, but just to acknowledge some of those comments and to sort of answer why we aren't digging in on those specifics today. And with that, I will put the PowerPoint back up and hand it back over to Marceline.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yes, our legal guidance there is that the other entity would love to dig in on those questions, and please stay engaged so we can do that. I will say, as Senator Van Hollen discussed, we're in a really difficult time, as we all know. Um, just to take a step back, I think most of you know the Maryland General Assembly meets for 90 days every year. And a number of bills this year, there are often 1,000 or more bills. A number of bills that we're seeing this year and that we're supporting are designed to basically codify laws that were happening at the federal level, at the state level where they're not preempted. So there has been a bill on, this click and cancel that we supported. There is legislation, as I talked about, around medical debt that basically duplicates and expands in some ways what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was doing. But again, trying in Maryland to put in place those policies that we're seeing weakened or rolled back at the federal level where we are able to by law. So, I'm speaking about the bills that we're taking a leadership role in. There are lots of other bills that we're weighing in on and writing testimony for, and would be happy to talk to you about those as well. But for this meeting, I'm just focusing on the ones where we're really leading. So, we were talking about the cost of utilities, and I think everyone's seen the cost skyrocket. As I said, we deal a lot with direct services with older adults and tenants, and we're seeing people have to make critical and painful choices around their utilities and affording rent and food. And we're seeing folks cutting back on basic necessities because of these increased costs. So we are working on several bills around clean, green, and affordable energy. We support environmental and sustainable energy, but really our focus is making sure that low income and working households have energy they can afford. So that's the role we play in those coalitions. And so, in terms of those coalitions, one of the areas we're working on is really focusing on what utility companies can do. They're basically monopolies, and what costs are being passed on to ratepayers. So there's a bill called the Ratepayer Freedom Act by Delegate Andre Johnson, and it essentially prohibits these monopolies from charging ratepayers from charging us for their lobbying expenses, the dinners they take legislators to, parties, and other expenses that don't benefit ratepayers. Right now, they can kind of roll those into the charges that we pay for. It's going to also require them to file transparency reports with the Public Service Commission so that there'll be clear and transparent accounting for what they are spending as they move to increase our rates. There is a bill that directly looks at some affordability, sponsored by Delegate Elizabeth Embry. It's House Bill 419. It's called the Ratepayer Protection Act. And it really focuses on making sure the money is spent responsibly by codifying some requirements on safety and cost effectiveness, but also requires gas utilities to look at non-pipeline alternatives, make sure they're spending money wisely, and really try to apply a fix-it-first approach so that rather than all new infrastructure, like working with what they have and trying to save and pass those costs on to ratepayers. And then Delegate Lord Charkoudian and Senator Ben Brooks have a bill called the Abundant Affordable Clean Energy Bill, which was House Bill 398 and Senate Bill 316. And that apply some creative solutions to meet the rising demand for electricity, which has been really rising quite rapidly in Maryland, with things like less expensive clean energy technologies like battery storage, and also reforms the solar crediting process to make solar credits more flexible, so that the state can scale solar projects. In terms of financial justice, we're focused on a couple different things. One is that we are part of the Fair Share Maryland Coalition. And as folks know, Maryland is facing a structural budget deficit right now. The Fair Share Maryland Coalition really wants to pass progressive taxation legislation. You heard Senator Van Hollen talk about what's happening at the federal level. We really want to try to protect critical assets and plans that have been in place for good education for all of our students across the state. Spending for our elders, spending on important affordable housing projects. So to do that, the Fair Share Coalition has called for taxation of the wealthiest Marylanders to increase their taxation and close corporate loopholes, among other changes. So we're supporting that and moving forward with a progressive taxation policy in Maryland so we can do all the things we need to do for low income and working households. We're supporting legislation around protecting older adults from financial exploitation. There's legislation that's being sponsored by Von Stewart next week that focuses on that. And Delegate Stewart, is also putting in place a progressive payment plan for traffic fines. We know that fines and fees are regressive and they hit low-income households much harder than wealthy households. And they also often fall hardest on Black and brown drivers because of where blue light cameras are stationed. And this will create a payment plan and one that's more progressive for low-income drivers. We are also looking at what's called an earned wage access product, which is really kind of payday loans by fintech, and it allows borrowers to borrow against their paycheck ahead of time, and they pay a service fee or they tip. But essentially, the cost of borrowing their own money to meet their expenses before their next payday ends up being 100% APR, up to 300% APR. So it really is like a payday loan, which we've banned in Maryland. So the legislation would basically say that no loans, including these products, can exceed our cap for small consumer loans, which is 36%. And it also addresses things like tipping. And really, as I think people have talked about in the chat, the real issue is that our minimum wage is not enough to meet the cost of living in Maryland. And certainly we're supporting organizations and work. We're not leading it, but we're supporting work around the minimum wage. We supported it last time and tried to tie it to see the consumer price index, and we continue to support that work. And then I'd say really the important role too in this environment is, as the great Fannie Lou Hamer said, nobody's free until everybody's free. So we're really holding space and creating time to support our allies, particularly standing with our immigrant communities, our LGBTQIA communities, and other vulnerable communities. CASA of Maryland is going to be having legislation around protecting identities for state agencies so that state agencies aren't turning over the names to ICE. We're going to be supporting that. We're going to be supporting Trans Maryland and LGBTQI communities around gender affirming care and around the needs of those communities as well. So I'm gonna just stop there. And I think Jennifer can pull up questions in the chat. And also, again, we'll be sending out an email next week um, with all of this information in more detail, as well as other ways to get involved, which we have on the next slide too.
Yes, thank you, Marceline. And for anyone who feels a little overwhelmed with all the bill numbers, trust me, we feel the same way. These 90 days are full of so many bills that we track, that we monitor, that we support, and often many that we oppose. And so we're just grateful that you're here to sort of absorb it all with us and to be part of this fight. Marceline, there's been some conversation around minimum wage and tip wages, which I think you answered well by saying we support those efforts, even if we don't lead on them. There is a question about the sort of epidemic of rural hospitals closing their doors and creating sort of these service voids. I know we primarily work on medical debt, and the direct consumer impact, but I don't know if you're aware of any partners or any legislation we're following that would deal with the closure of rural hospitals in particular.
It is an issue. I mean, Senator Hershey represents some of those communities, and so I think that's why he's been such a strong champion on this issue. And we are seeing, like in certain communities, folks driving like to Delaware, folks driving to West Virginia for care because it's closer. And the downside of that, the good side is it's closer for them, and you don't have a lot of choice if it's an emergency situation. The downside is they don't have the protections that we do in terms of medical debt. So that is a huge issue. We do work with the Health Services Cost Review Commission, and there is some legislation and efforts now that they're working on around looking at existing disparities and social disparities of health and their model for how hospitals are compensated. And part of that is looking at rural areas. So again, that's something we're involved in and we're supporting, but we don't lead on. And another one I should just mention is that Healthcare for All, led by Vinnie DeMarco, has been leading the effort around prescription affordability of drugs in Maryland. And there are efforts this year to look at again what the prices are that Marylanders are paying, and also if we can like address the price of generics. And so again, those are efforts that we're supporting, we'll be weighing in on, but we're not leading on. But I think it is very clear there's a lot of work to do on a number of issues. We try to make it easy and we'll send out, like I said, a little spreadsheet later, but you know, there are lots of ways for people who are Marylanders to work at the state level to try to put some protections in place for working families.
And I think just one more question before we jump to, how to stay involved and next steps. But there is a question around, again, sort of this minimum wage issue, but specifically with daycare workers. And I can only imagine that some of our attendees here have seen the news about the governor's budget and how it does reduce some of the funding, particularly for low-income families who've been getting childcare scholarships. So that's been a big point of discussion, and I think where a lot of the energy is right now when it comes to daycare. But I don't know if you've been hearing any chatter around minimum wages and daycare specifically.
I know that there's a bill that it doesn't have a bill hearing yet, but it's around childcare affordability and looking at ways to make childcare more affordable. But I will say that with Fair Share Maryland Coalition, there's a meeting I think on next Monday, but we are going to be working with a number of allies, including a number of labor leaders, a number of folks that are working on with Marylanders Against Poverty, which are a number of social service groups, groups that work on direct service. we're going to be talking Monday, and a lot of the effort around the budget is both to push for progressive policies like closing corporate loopholes and taxing the wealthiest Marylanders and protecting these vital services. So, I don't have a lot to say right now, simply to say that we're part of that fight, and we're going to be having discussions next week about strategy and what folks need to do. And again, we'll be sharing all of that out as an email alerts and a blast throughout the 90-day session as well, and ways for people to engage.
That feels like a perfect segue to talk about how to stay engaged. Do you want to touch on this really quickly before we
Yep,
let
I
everyone
will
go?
touch on this really quickly. Thank you also again for everyone who's joined us, and thank you again for taking some time on a Friday to engage. We really appreciate your time and energy. Um, and I'll just say, you know, contact us. These are ways to email us. We're on Facebook. We're on Blue Sky. Join our mailing list. And our mailing list mainly focuses over the next 90 days on action alerts, but we also have events. We also have direct service programs. We also have Know Your Rights trainings. And we're doing a Know Your Rights training on January 29th in Baltimore City at Red MS Cafe. We've passed so much legislation over the past 4 years. It's really making sure individuals know what their rights are, how to protect themselves from medical debt, and how to make sure that they're getting all of the benefits of the laws that have passed. And we're also organizing focus groups around the cost the cost of living right now, around the economy. And we're using the conversations from these focus groups, which will be anonymous and they're online, to help advocate and make the point to legislators and the governor that costs are rising for everyone. Working families are struggling, low-income households are struggling, middle-class families are struggling, and they need to have a budget that reflects the um, needs of the majority, middle class, working class, low income, not the minority of wealthy, and that means saving these important programs. So and passing other policies that affect the families and economic issues we're concerned about. So you can also join our focus group. We would love that to get your insights and opinions, and also send you a little thank you gift. But we really appreciate that. And last, of course, if you feel moved, we would love for you to donate. We are up against wealthy corporations who spend hundreds of thousands of dollars over the 90 days paying high paid lobbyists who make $1 million, $2 million over 90 days representing corporate interest. And it's me and my policy associate at Economic Action. So any support you can give would be great as well. But we will send out an email next week for everyone who registered, just telling you a little bit more about these bills. So you can click on them if you want to follow more, and other ways to get engaged, and also things you'd like us to know, or things you'd like to see us doing, and ways to stay engaged.
Thank you. So
Thank
thank you,
you.
Marceline. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We really appreciate not just that you were here, but there was so much great conversation in the chat, some really great questions. And it's clearly just such a thoughtful and really your sleeves rolled up group of people. So thank you for everything you're doing. And I will just do another request. We are getting ready. Next year will be our 25th anniversary. So please do consider making a donation as we get ready for that. Our hope is to raise 25,000 in small dollar contributions for that 25th anniversary to show that we really are people powered. So $5, $10, every penny makes a big difference, especially as we run that people powered campaign. So thank you.
And we will send out the PowerPoint. I saw a note in the chat. We will send out the PowerPoint slides as well as kind of a cheat sheet on the legislation for everyone early next week. So thank you for raising that, and we'll make sure you get both of these. So
So thank you. With
thank
that,
you.
enjoy the rest of your weekend or almost weekend.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend and stay strong, and look forward to talking to y'all soon and working together.